This is Space Ants, Obsidian's Sting, an original composition by Eric Kay. The once fat queen had slimmed down. Nearly 65% of her old bulk was gone, and mostly to the eggs. Her claustral isolation ended when she finally birthed a new brood, new female workers. Hexalin was a handmaiden ant, the sixth. Her one and only job was to work, but that was no problem, because none could ever accuse space ants of being lazy. From first light until the final silent black overtakes her, Hexalin would have a lifetime of purposeful activity. The handmaidens were generalist, who could fight, forage, or feed, depending on the need of the fledgling colony. Right now, in these early days, she was never far from the queen, and never far from her sisters, the 5 other maidens. Her carapace was white with youth. It had not hardened yet, and she crawled around the tiny enclosure. As a caretaker, she instinctively tended to the queen. She ripped off nodules of their stored insect jelly and fed them to the queen. Good. The queen tapped on their antenna as she ate. There were many more eggs to lay. Their enclosure was cramped, and she dug with her sisters into the ice and rock, slowly excavating new chambers for the colony. They also recycled the body of the dead ant, the male jumper drone, which landed them here. She tended to the translucent domed wings of the queen that housed them. And of course, she tended to the eggs. And the next clutch was nearly ready. When the darkness fell upon them, the 6 handmaidens rested to conserve oxygen, as the blue-green algae stored in the jelly stopped making air. But the night was brief in their wide orbit, this far from their gas giant. On the outskirts of the queen, a membrane encompassed them all, a simple thin film, which kept in the low-pressure atmosphere against the hard vacuums of deep space. It was a colonial placenta of sorts. Soon it would harden, but for now it was flexible. They were the domed wings of a hatchling queen. Wings which had once allowed queens to fly in nuptial ecstasy with her drone when their moon was still alive. Over the many generations of the space ants' hard forging, it had morphed far away from its original purpose of flying in their moon's once great atmosphere. That sky was long dead, but nature never gives up. It recycles structures, ideas, and chemical reactions, like it recycles bodies. Night was over, and Hexalin tended to the eggs. She cleaned them gingerly with her mandibles and stored them in the protective tunnels. Though radiation was of less concern in the outer rings, it was an instinct they carried. Then she shuttled the nodules of blue-green algae out of shadow and into sunlight. Hexalin was busy, and as soon as she put one in sunshine, it would soon be shadowed by their nest's slow rotation. The movement of their bodies around the small space was enough to have caused the structure to slowly rotate one way or the other. As soon as it stabilized, some other handmaiden destabilized it. Each sister would require another to go about her task in the opposite way to counteract spin. And so the 6 would dance. Every action required an equal and opposite reaction, coordinated and opposing, to keep the translucent winged dome pointed towards the sunlight, to keep the blue-green algae pumping out oxygen. Darkness was death. But onward they worked, never quitting, except for a night's rest, never doubting, only searching. They dug and mined and moved things around, busily hollowing out a nest amongst the ice. Their home turned out to be far dirtier than expected. Bits of rock, frozen mud, and ice. But ever ingenious, they combined it with their waste and coated the tunnels for insulation, and to plug any little holes that might steal their atmosphere. Every act was a tiny scratch toward victory. Anything for one more orbit. Tenacious. Good girls, the queen said to each of them when they got in range of her antenna. Help now. Her membrane had grown to its fullest extent. It was time to move. The queen struggled and heaved as the maidens bit at the wing's joints, severing the great mother ant and freeing her from the hardened wings. And down she went, into the excavations, into her new royal chamber. And so the colony grew, and as greenhouse ants were birthed, the maidens placed their bulbous rear end to the bottom of small tunnels and allowed them to inflate and break out of the mound into hard vacuum. There was, of course, a second line of defense, a mucky mixture of their own refuse which they built into a black wall. Now there was air, light, water, and growth. The handmaidens' exoskeletons darkened with age and sunlight. They were adults now, and would be soon responsible for managing the hundreds of other ants soon to be birthed. Raw evolution told them that inwards was death, and outwards was life. But evolution could not tell them that danger still lurked in the quiet orbits of the outer rim as it did in the inner. It had no knowledge of the great power that smashed their world, had and would do it again. Outside, their dim eyes had spied only glimpses of it. Whatever it was, that the previous dead drone ant had seen it and guided their colony egg towards it. It had been hope for them that this shiny white rock might be fortuitous, and that the massive sphere of ice, far on the horizon, might be a home to hope for. But the previous colony had not known of the orbital complexities. They were ants, after all. The massive ice moon, which the previous colonial watchers had seen, was more dangerous than anticipated. Every so often the white mass loomed large in their sky, and its distortions disturbed many things. Hexalin was awoken to the shudders of multiple impacts. The shake and reverberation were startling, but then she felt or heard the most horrendous of sounds, the hissing of lost atmosphere. She inhaled as much as of the now rarefied air as possible into her black, hard exoskeleton. She scurried out from the dark interior hallway and into the new light, shafting through holes in the wrong places. Her sisters all instinctively knew the same thing without the dance of antennae. Vibrations of legs scurried around as they poured from the center out into the outer shell. Pressure loss. Light stabbed through the previously hardened mud which formed the protoskin of the colony. They did not even have a functioning door ant yet, and Hexalin threw herself at the holes. Not today, Death! She placed the ends of her 6 limbs through all the holes. There, splayed in an awkward shape, she stopped the leaking atmosphere. One of her sisters came in the dark and dabbled a mixture on one leg. Hexalin retracted that leg back in, and the slurried patch expanded out and sealed. Again, 5 more times, they repeated the process and sealed the holes. Hexalin and the handmaidens crawled over the transparent dome, searching for more holes. None were found. Atmosphere was lost, but the danger was temporarily halted. Next, Hexalin crawled down the individual holes where the greenhouse ants were wedged. Her feelers ran over something wet. All around the tunnel were the rapidly decompressed fluids of another ant. Again, she investigated. It was one of her sisters. Sliced open along the gas door, the sister twitched in near death. Her dying antennae seemed to tap out, recycle me. Though it was jerky and incomprehensible to words, for queen and colony was implied. Just a fleeting thought to still be of use, even in death. But Hexalin could not comfort her. Hexalin had a mission. When greenhouse ants, and all ants for that matter, detected the loss of pressure, they too had inhaled as much as possible. Their outward-facing abdomens were swelled with extra atmosphere. Danger done. Hexalin's antennae danced over theirs. One by one, she repeated the message, and slowly they exhaled some of what they had stored. She ran back into the main hall of the fledgling colony to check on the queen. Running back over the dead sister, she encountered a big head ant. It had done her job. The queen was safely sealed in her chamber. Bigheads were a breed of door ants who were interior stoppers, which prevented a catastrophic loss of air from the queen's chamber. Hexalin ran her antennae over the door ant. Good, she communicated and went to the queen. Safe, she questioned the queen. The queen affirmed, though Hexalin knew she was stressed. Stressed queens lay fewer eggs. Out of the royal chamber, Hexalin ran out and back to the hallway. The tunnel was full of many mixed scents, of death, of boiled blood, of old scent trails. Chaotic. So Hexalin felt around the body with her antennae. There in the split abdomen, she found a heavy shard, the thing that had pierced their colony's thin cover and killed her sister. She inspected the body. There was a clean slice through the abdomen. Surgical would be the word, but space ants did not have that in their lexicon. There was no medical cast yet. Her antenna danced over the shard inquisitively. Then she felt pain after running one antenna straight over the edge. Rock of pain? She wondered and inspected the body again. Rock sliced straight? The shard was long and sharp. Uncertain what to do with it, she left it in the wounded abdomen and dragged her sister to the trash heap. This room had yet to be fully excavated, so she began to dig. She scraped away at the hardened mire and gnawed at the ice. There was little room in the tiny space. Aggravated by the slow progress, she went back and dismembered her dead sister to better fold her corpse up into what space existed. Since this dump was for organic matter, The shard had to go. She wrested it from the body. Her mandibles held it, then tried to exit, but only wedged it into the ice. The point penetrated, but not much farther than expected. Then, stabilizing herself with legs sticking all around the small cavity, she spun her body around to get to the room's exit. To her surprise, the shard seemed to easily penetrate the ice now. Fragments of ice floated up and hit her face, smacking into her sensitive antennae. She tried again, placing the shard into the ice, then spinning her body around and rotating the shard. Again, the ice broke faster. This was far easier than when she chewed on the ice. Her tiny mind made the jump, a stinger for hardness, one that could pierce the hard ice. Ice was cold, and ants did not generate heat very well, which is why they coated their rooms with mud to insulate their tunnels. So they very much did not like excavating ice directly with their bodies. Although the shard was dense, it was more pleasant than putting mandibles to ice. During their searches, the other handmaidens found refuse and brought them to the correctly sorted dump piles. The ants were fastidious. Hexalyn searched in the inorganic pile. Whenever she found shards of nearly any size, she showed to her sisters and the new batch of workers how to use them to drill into the ice and loose rock. And so the colony expanded. Weavers and workers, soldiers and male drones, they all were produced in abundance. Tunnels were bored straight through the ice. But the shards dulled or broke. When their moon died, large bursts of lava were squeezed out into their cold ocean. Again and again, the tug of their gas giant squeezed their planet like a soft aphid, spurting its fiery interior out into the cold water of their once liquid oceans. That fast frozen silica, the magma interior of their moon, was broken up, thrown around their gas giant, all throughout their ring system. And in the presence of the nearby ice moon's gravity perturbations, some fragments spun around the gravity well and back in the opposite direction of the ring's general rotation, and collided. With Kessler syndrome-like efficiency, shards peppered everything, and over the thousands of unobserved orbits, the colony's ice rock had been struck with 1 million super-sharp fragments. But this was a secret blessing. As they colonized their asteroid, either venturing out or digging in, the space ants found more shards. Some workers were injured handling them, others had their appendages or antennae sliced clear off. But as they learned, they shaped the obsidian so a dull end could be gripped while the stinger end remained sharp. When colonies grow, they pull in new floating rocks. It's in the odd way the clumps move together that makes it obvious. They float in an unnatural formation, bound together but not contact binaries, and growth attracts attention. But out here, density was far lower than the constant stream of rocks in the inner ring. The long stretches altered their search patterns. Where previously the colonies tried to be fast-moving and send out many scouts, here they relied on the thin, frail ecosystem of cyanobacteria and light, fungus and iron, and time. So, when the citer bugs see any rock, they relay that information back. And when the distributed brains of the ant colony identify and conclude that orbits will intersect as near as chance allowed, each colony knows it must send at least one scout to explore. They looked and concluded, the trajectories will get close. Now they waited. Hexalyn's colony was ready, and in fact were courting invasion by concealing their numbers. Workers had used the mud and the filth to craft crude exterior tunnels. Those had no atmosphere, but the sunlight warmed them, and most importantly, hid the swarm. They also grew more door ants under these tunnels, which could allow more warriors to exit at a moment's notice. Warriors which stood at the ready with their crude weapons, shiny black stingers of obsidian. Better than mandibles, which required ants to chew and scissor a limb, these could slice an ant clean in two. Longer than stingers, they could reach ahead and strike first. There in the distance the colony saw it. Another mass of rock migrating together, impossibly grouped rocks. These were not contact binaries or gravitationally bound. It was another ant colony. The citers told the signalers, and in the great colony's distributed consciousness, the colony knew. Prey. The unsuspecting colony floated closer. Their male scouts jumped off their rock and slid through the void. The drone males were secured with thin silver threads of silk to their home rock. Hexalyn waited with great anticipation in one of these exterior tunnels. They all held their breath, antennas all checking with each other. Then she felt muffled thumps as foreign ants hit their rock. Now, the signaler ants communicated. The counter-assault began. Warriors and workers swarmed out of the exterior tunnels. Hexalin was carried along with the wave of bodies out the tunnels, and quickly each enemy scout had 6 allied ants to them, each pulling at an appendage, immobilizing and overpowering the hapless enemy. Hexalin and a signaler ant came up to the nearest captured drone. "Which tribe?" it inquired, which was not so much a sentence, and more like the automatic response that each ant gives each other to find out who's who, and if it is a friendly colony. The scout's response was truly indecipherable. They were not even a distant relation, though perhaps we'll call them the White Moon tribe. The actual communication, the very specific dance of antennae, was like a secret handshake for ants. The signaler ant came back to Hexalin, communicated what the trapped ant had said. Hexalin herself went over and ran her own antennae over the enemy, careful to avoid the mandibles which the enemy was now biting at anything. What tribe? White Moon. White Moon? Hexalin memorized the dance of antennae. White Moon, she communicated back. Then she took her shard and killed the enemy in one slice. Other scouts of White Moon tried to flee back up their silken lines once they discovered Hexalin's colony rock was not lifeless. Far from it, Hexalin's colony was much larger than anticipated. While the ants pinned the hapless drones to their home rock, weavers scurried up the safety lines, weaving them thicker. Behind the weavers were allied warriors. It was a rather unorthodox attack, but Hexalin's colony was new to this orbit and carried new strategies. Apparently White Moon had some sort of intellectual bottleneck, which colonies of the inner orbits had not the luxury of keeping. Hiding your numbers was not a commonplace strategy known out here. The opposite was true. Making one's colony seem larger than possible to scare off invaders was the common tactic. White Moon threw most of the weavers off as they tried to braid the thin lines. One intelligent enemy ant simply chewed the safety line, dooming their drone to a death it was already going to encounter. But 2 allied weavers secured one silk cord and reinforced it with braided line. Now the 2 colonies were joined. Those weavers tried to fend off a counterattack. Hexalin followed the swarm to the one good line. She had her orders. 2 large allied soldiers were already ahead of her. They landed while she was midway. Now there were 4 allied ants on the enemy rock, and they formed a bridgehead. Enemies from White Moon ran and communicated back to their colony. They were now under attack. In a few moments, a coherent battle line was formed. The weavers were pulled into the enemy melee, one to dismemberment, the other probably flung off into space. But the 2 soldier ants carried Obsidian. They immediately skewered a White Moon soldier ant and caused the cautious enemies to dance around the invaders, trying to outflank the glinting black points. The sacrifice of the weavers was a worthy delay. Hexalin was down the line and stood with the soldiers. She scurried over one and caught an enemy in the side, immediately slicing off 2 legs. The injured creature flailed, lost its footing, and floated away with its severed appendages. 2 more allied soldiers scurried over the silk line, their bodies red in the reflected light from their gas giant. Now the 4 formed a team, a beachhead on enemy territory. They stabbed and killed and pushed back. One soldier lost his obsidian blade inside the body of a dead enemy warrior, then grappled with the enemy ants over the bodies of the slain. More warriors came, some armed, others only with their natural weapons, and a stable perimeter was formed. Hexalin halted her fight. She took her obsidian and drilled directly into the enemy rock. It was like theirs, loose collections of frozen water, dirt, and rubble. The obsidian drilled straight. More allied warriors crawled over her and expanded the assault, keeping her securely in the middle of now 10 soldiers. She twisted, and the drill kept boring a larger hole. Another worker came down the line with new obsidian. She let her now dulled point float away and took the worker's new sharp blade. She dug until she heard the sharp hiss of escaping air. She had pushed into the enemy colony and exposed a tunnel. The worker assisted her and clawed the hole open. Bits of debris floated off with the limbs and the dead. Now the space was wide enough for her to enter. Hexalin met an enemy worker whose antenna demanded her to identify herself. "White Moon," she replied. At that, the worker seemed placated, unsure of anything happening with the battle and concerned only with trying to patch the new hole. Hexalin was careful not to stab that worker with the obsidian she was holding and instead pushed it against the wall. The worker walked over her and investigated the hole. Hexalin carried on searching for the royal chamber. With zero air pressure, it was hard to catch the scent of the queen. Her compound eyes looked for clues in ultraviolet or infrared, but the scurrying of other workers, who questioned her identity each time, painted a confusing scene. She crawled around the enemy's nest until she found an egg chamber. Her antennae danced over the mounds, but she could tell these were not new eggs. The pupae here were old. They writhed with worry from the lack of air pressure. These eggs had been moved from the queen's chamber long ago. Over walls and down tubes, she headed for the center, where most of the time space ants' queens could be found. She encountered a bid-headed ant, which blocked her passage forward. "Identify," it seemed to ask. Hexalin replied with Obsidian's sting. She stabbed it in the head. Its mandibles made a feeble snap, but Hexalin had killed it almost outright, or at least immediately severing the facial nerves. Then she pushed the head in and felt air slowly leak out. She was now so far in that either the hole had been patched or the tight tunnels allowed little air to escape. Hexalin shoved the dead ant's big head back. Though deceased, it was still coiled like a spring with sufficient force to keep the pressure out. She took some deep breaths and felt only a moment's relief. Now she could smell the enemy queen ahead, and she was sealed in here. It was either death or dismemberment from here on out. The passages twisted, and after one last turn, she saw the queen's features lit up in infrared. The massive beast was easily 3 times the size of Hexalin, but was immobilized by her girth and ovipositor. Around the chamber, the warmth of freshly laid eggs glowed slightly in infrared. The queen smelled Hexalin's foreign stench in the thin air. There was no fooling her with the copied antennae dance. The queen screamed and pounded her legs, trying to call for help. The room was pitch black, but the thumping vibrated the rock and shook the thin air and Hexalin's hairs, allowing her to perceive the wretched queen. A frontal assault would not win. The queen, though not a warrior, still had considerable size and strength advantage. In the darkness, Hexalin darted between newly laid eggs and over to the side. She could feel the frantic queen uselessly flailing her midlimbs to search for the intruder. Hexalin clung to the back of the queen, who tried desperately to reach behind. It was panicked, and then tried to bounce or slam Hexalin against the walls of her royal chamber, which was too spacious. Hexalin went to slice off at the joint of the petiole and ala trunk. She missed. Instead, she sliced a femur cleanly with her sharp blade. Blood floated around, gently spraying the wall with a gore graffiti announcing, "The queen was here." The old queen tried to turn her head behind her to bite Hexalin, but could not. The 5 other limbs reached behind, but the joints would not allow. She tugged and tried to rip her ovipositor and detach her body from the egg-laying structure. Screams of one in the violent battle between life and death rang through the colony. Her colony tugged and opened the big head of the interior door ant to rescue her. Hexalin crawled on top of the queen and shoved her blade into the giant carapace. She twisted, severing the head. The queen died, and more blood oozed out of the pronotum. "There's room for only my queen," Hexalin thought. They never were a polygyne colony. She covered herself with the queen's scent and hid. Other ants had come into the room and searched, finding only a freshly dead queen. Slowly, Hexalin exited the royal chamber. Doused in the queen's scent, soldiers from White Moon came to her, smelled her, and listened to her claim to be the new queen. Everywhere she went, she pacified the warriors. The violence ended swiftly as she walked all over the enemy's nest. Nature's willing to fight to the death, but it hates waste. Its violence was as swift as it was terrible, merciless in battle, but abundantly graceful in peace. In reality, Hexalin had saved 2 colonies. The energy margins were too slim for long wars of attrition. They were not so genetically dissimilar after all. And even if they were, had they not both cultivated fungus, aphids, blue-green algae, and a myriad other species? How different were they? They had won, prevailed against a larger colony, with wit, tools, and the desire to win. Afterwards, the 2 colonies were hauled together, forming one of the greats out within the outer rim of the rings. Over time, the watchers in both colonies, now merged, saw strange things. Orbits gone weird. Outward was life, and inward was death. But now they were once again falling inward. But not inward to the gas giant. Inward to the white moon. The colony knew this in a collective, distributed sense, but none knew what to do. They were captured in a horseshoe orbit of the ice moon. This has been Space Ants, Obsidian Sting, an original creation by Eric Kay, copyright 2024. Join us again next month for another installment of Space Ants.